Well, we're gonna go socially distance ourselves at Garage Mahal again.
That's always fun.
Well, it's good, and we're working on the railroad. The fun thing there is we're getting an awful lot done.
We are.
And we did that show just a while back on laying the switches and how to scratch build switches and everything. Well, today we're hooking up switch stands. Well, a switch stand to a switch, but the process is there. We'll hook up the other 6 off camera. So this is hooking up the switch stands and building the switch stands to run the switch that we already laid in the other show. Well, now that I've laid a couple of switches, we need to actually be able to control the things, and I want to control them with actual switch stands, just like on the prototype Denver and Rio Grande Western. Now, fortunately, there's a really neat kit by Llagas Creek. It's all brass, so it's really strong, and you can buy it with the castings cleaned up. But to save money, and just because it's fun, I decided to just buy raw castings and do all of that work myself. Now, the kit doesn't include the crossbar, and so you sort of have to improvise something, come up with your own design. I tried doing something here with styrene plastic, but I was just experimenting. The castings are still on their casting sprue, straight out of the cristobalite from the foundry. And so you have to start by going through here and cleaning up all of the castings, which involves drilling about 10 really teeny tiny holes in things with small drill bits, which are very fragile. My bit. And then, of course, there's a good deal of filing and sanding and just general cleaning up to get rid of any sense of parting lines or problems that you may have, especially once you cut them away from the sprue, because there's always going to be the little gate area that needs cleaning up. Perfect. But it's easier to do the drilling when it's still on the sprue. This piece here is the top of the swivel mechanism that holds the handle and rotates around the top of the bow to lock the switch in place. Here's what the prototype looks like. Now I'm cutting everything away from the sprues using a Dremel with a cutoff wheel. A little bit hazardous. You want to make sure you've got eye protection, and in this case magnifiers as well, because I really can't see the teeny tiny fine work here without them. Now in this case, the inside of the casting also needs to be cleaned up, the hole down through there which holds the shaft, which rotates the piece back and forth. Here we can see that on the prototype. So I need to get inside this casting and clean up the burrs and imperfections in the inside. So I'm going to do that here on my drill press with a 1/4 inch bit, and that becomes quite simply done. Now the flat sections of the castings I like to clean up here on my belt sander. This is what I did, of course, when laying the switches in order to clean up the frog and points. But any flat sections like this are easiest cleaned up right here on the belt sander. You can get them nice and straight and true. Now that my castings are all cleaned up and ready to go, I'm ready to start assembling the switch stand. Now the switch stand being a working thing, I have to be careful not to bind up the mechanism. This pole here runs down through the middle of the harp and has to be free to swivel back and forth in order to lock the points in place. As it's a working part, it also has to be really strong so I don't break it when I'm using it. So I'm using silver solder to hold the whole thing together. I love soldering brass, but I really like using Stay Bright silver solder, which is what I'm using here. It's stronger than the regular solder, and frankly, I find it easier to work with as well. Now the pole itself, of course, has to be free to swivel back and forth, and so the bottom is secured with a little clip as opposed to being soldered so that it can swivel inside the bow.
Well, that's really cool. Look at that. Oh, the little thing down there. Well, oh my word. There you go.
And that locks in place.
Nice.
Sweet.
Well, there it is.
One switch stand. One down and six to go.
Several to go.
Now, most of the stands are tall stands in order to get the switch lantern and target up into the air where the locomotive engineer can see it more readily, and that involves soldering a shaft to the center and then fabricating some sort of daylight target. Now, the kit comes with these targets, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to use them or not, but I went ahead and cut them out and prepared them. But I want to do some experimenting here. This looks okay, but I think I can come up with something that looks a little bit more like the prototype. This looks like it's mounted through the center shaft, where an actual daylight target is mounted to the center shaft. And so I found these. They're stamping blanks on Amazon for making dog tags and that sort of thing. That might work out just fine for a daylight target. So I ordered some of these, and I'm waiting for those to come. And I hope it will look more like this, because as you can see on the prototype, it's just simply a flat metal plate. In this case, with some bullet holes in it.
That's why they call it a day target, so somebody has something to shoot at during daylight hours.
Well, I guess this is something. I actually want to model it with at least one of them with the bullet holes, because I think that's kind of fun.
That's going to be a challenge.
Well, I now have 6 of my 7 stands finished and ready for paint, and while I'm kind of messing around with the 7th, I figured I'd go ahead and get paint on these because I want to go ahead and hook a couple of them up. I'm chomping at the bit to get on this. So I took these 6 over to the paint booth to get some paint on them, and that's going to start by putting a primer on here. Now, I've always used the Flow Quill Railroad Colors primer from back in the day. It's long discontinued, unfortunately. It's a lacquer primer. Fortunately, it's just automotive lacquer primer, and it's still readily available. So I buy quart cans of that and then refill my little bottles from those quart cans. But I love using a lacquer primer over metal, especially brass. It just holds to the metal really, really well and provides a really nice base for your color. Of course, it's important to make sure you're getting the primer down into all of the little nooks and crannies. You don't want to leave any brass exposed. But there it is, and then let that primer sit for a while. I've even tried baking this in the oven, and that does seem to improve the adhesion of the paint to the metal. In this case, I'm just letting it dry a couple of days, and then I'm shooting my rust color on here. This is Tester's rust, flat rust. They just discontinued this. It just seems like everything gets discontinued. But what I'm doing is I thin that with lacquer thinner, and then it behaves like a lacquer instead of an enamel. I hate Tester's enamels. Frankly, they're just disgusting to work with. But if you thin them with lacquer thinner, they'll behave very much like the old railroad colors, like a lacquer. Of course, then there's toxic fumes to deal with, so there's that. Now, just outside the garage mahal here is our reference switch stand. This is the color that I'm going after, and you can see it's a much darker color. I don't mind that the initial coating of rust is a really bright rust, a color not found in nature at all, because I'm planning to come back and put a dark wash over the top of the whole thing to try to achieve something like the rusty patina with little bits of paint left over. This is the look that I'm after right here, as opposed to that perfect rust color that I've already shot on there. So I'm going to do that by applying a wash of acrylic paint thinned with alcohol.
And where did you find alcohol?
In the pandemic, it's good.
In the pandemic aisle.
I actually got it in the camping aisle.
Yeah, camping aisle, right.
Yeah, it was very camp. No, it's denatured alcohol that you can get for your lantern. So anyway, my process here is to apply quite a bit of this very thinned down, just black color. This is Blick acrylic, just in a black. And then I come back with a dry brush with nothing on it and start taking some of the color back off. And then I'll work that back and forth. I'll put a little more of this very, very dilute color on and then take it back off with the dry brush and just keep working that back and forth and back until I achieve the color that I'm after. Perhaps just a little bit darker than the color that I'm after, because I am going to come back with my rust color again and the airbrush and just lightly mist everything with a rust color. It helps sort of even everything out, and I really like that effect. So far, so good.
There you go.
So as you can see here, it's come out a bit darker than I'd like. I still like the look, and I could live with this. But what I want to do now is take it back over to the paint booth and just lightly mist over these guys. You can see that the color is a little bit uneven and a little bit too dark. And so by misting over it with the rust color, I can achieve this look right here. And to me, this is a really nice finished look. More even, a little bit lighter, and looks really like nice rusty metal. Now this guy right here is a shorty, a short switch stand, and on the real railroad they would use these short switch stands in places where there were tight clearances, or where a tall switch stand might sweep somebody off the side of the car if they were riding on the car, which in the yard they tend to do quite often. And in my yard I have such a place, so I'm going to use a shorty there. Okay, I'm ready to hook up my points now to the switch stand. This was one of my earliest experiments here, a styrene crossbar. I didn't intend to actually use this, I was just experimenting. This is what the crossbar looks like on the prototype railroad. And if I were to just simply make a copy of this out of plastic, it would be way too flimsy, and if I make it out of brass, it'll short the whole railroad out. So I thought about making something out of styrene, and I like the look, but when I talked to Mike over at Llagas Creek, he said, why don't you use fiberglass circuit board material? That's what we use. And he sent me a couple of strips of this material here. And he's right, this is the way to go. It's really strong and it's easy to work with. I drilled through it and put a pin through there and soldered that in place, connecting it to the linkage that runs over to the switch stand. I wanted to make sure that this was flexible because over time it might break if it's rigid. At any rate, I'm now ready to set the stand and then bolt the crossbar to the points. But there's a catch here, or I don't want there to be a catch here, because normally when you're hooking one of these things up, you're hooking it to a switch machine or something, and you're doing that with a spring-loaded linkage of some kind, so that your tolerances don't have to be exactly correct. There's a spring holding the points tight against the rail. Well, in this case, everything is rigid and has to lock in place just like it does on the actual railroad. And so if my measurements are the slightest bit off, my points either won't close or it will leave a gap. So I had to figure out a way to set the spacings here to make it exactly correct. So after a good deal of consideration and meditation on the subject, I came up with this for an idea. I'm going to loosely hold the switch stand in place and figure out the spacing at the far end for the straight route. And then I put a stack of styrene under here to brace the end of the crossbar so that I could drill it with the crossbar in place and the switch stand in place. So I made sure there was just a little bit of crossbar hanging out beyond the stock rail, and this looks like this is going to be good. So I'm ready to drill and screw my straight route points in place to the crossbar. I'm using these Walther's 0090 brass hex head screws. They look really nice and they're reasonably easy to work with. Unfortunately, they're also fairly fragile because they're tiny, and that did become an issue right straight away, because I drilled through the points here, and then I put a smaller hole into the fiberglass so that I could simply tap and run the screw down into the fiberglass, and I managed to break two of these off trying to screw them into place. In the future, I'm probably going to use a nut on the bottom, but in this case I was finally able to set the third screw in place, and it seems to be tight and it seems to be strong and working. I've been trying to figure out how exactly I'll get a nut onto the back of this in the future, and I think what I'll do is drill everything in place with it temporarily mounted, and then take it all back apart and then glue the nut to the back side of the crossbar. And that should be a much better way to hook this up. Anyway, at this point, I'm ready to spike my switch stand in place. So with the switch stand locked into the straight position and with the straight points closed, pushing that over and holding it tight against the stock rail, I spiked the stand in place with 6 spikes. Now, as this is a working switch stand, I'm also going to glue it, because in moving it back and forth like this, it'll be easy to eventually work those spikes free. Anyway, now I'm ready to go ahead and drill and tap and screw the diverging points into place. So I lock the stand into the diverging route, and then with the points closed for the diverging route, I'm ready to drill and tap and screw the diverging points to the crossbar. So this was the same process with the little 0090 brass screw, and now I have a complete working switch stand. Locks.
Fun. Oh, look at it move the rail.
Yeah. So, like this.
Uh-huh. Woohoo!
Lock it.
It's another route.
And switch it and lock it.
All right. Woo!
It works.
Yay!
Well, it was fun.
That was.
Yeah, it's a little bit challenging. The first one is always a challenge.
Yeah.
And I've got one more to build. It's almost finished. And then I'll have all 7 switch stands, and one is hooked up, and actually one is almost hooked up now.
Wow.
And then we'll just keep proceeding until we have a whole switching yard with operating switch stands. That's really neat. That's really neat. And then we're going to move on to putting day targets and lanterns on the switch stand. So that'll be an upcoming show, is the lanterns and day targets on the switch stands, which is a whole other ball game, doing the working illuminated switch lanterns.
Yes.
And you get to help with that one, because we have to scratch build switch lanterns.
Oh boy.
Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, do pop on over to the channel. And if you're not a subscriber, here comes the blue button. Are we ready for it? Right there, blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here again when we start building some switch lanterns. We'll see you then.
We'll see you.
Bye-bye.